So I've been wondering who is going to be the next big interview with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it looks like we have Officer Tatum. So I was very surprised to see this interview in my YouTube feed, and I was completely caught off guard, but I also understood that this is kind of like a podcast tour that Netanyahu is doing, and so it is good to see a black guy get this interview, and I know that PBD got a lot of flack in his comment section for even doing the interview and then not offering a whole lot of pushback, and Officer Tatum basically did more or less the same thing, except he was very clear that he is pro-Israel, and he did ask Netanyahu to address a lot of the things that have been said about Israel and Netanyahu specifically, and so this was very similar to the PBD interview, but the comment section was very different. There were a lot of people in Officer Tatum's comment section praising him or congratulating him or just giving him kudos for even being able to land an interview with someone of Netanyahu's caliber. Let's break down this interview. This is heyybritny. Welcome back. Okay, so let's talk about the vibes of this interview. So I could tell that in both interviews, Netanyahu was trying to seem relatable to the average person who is watching these interviews on Officer Tatum's channel and then also PBD's channel. In PBD's interview, I could see more attempts to be relatable. There were a few things that he talked about where you could kind of see where he was kind of trying to make himself seem kind of like more ordinary. Like there was a moment where he was talking about something and he was like, oh, I wish I had the slide here. Oh, well, dang it, or something like that, right? So he's trying to make you comfortable, make you relaxed, and make you kind of feel like you and him are the same. And so I did not mind that. I think that in both interviews, he does seem like he's a nice person, and the way that he's talking about himself in Israel, you can kind of understand why people are pro-Israel and why they take his side and all of that stuff. He doesn't seem like he's a crazy maniac ranting and raving in each interview. He seems poised, he seems relatable, he seems confident in what he's saying, and he seems like he's really trying to engage with whoever's interviewing him. But at the same time, if you are outside of the bubble of these two interviews and you are looking at different resources and different news articles and all of that stuff about the Israel-Gaza war, you may have a different interpretation of these interviews. So I didn't necessarily find anything kind of like gross or disturbing about these interviews. He does seem like you're talking to a normal person and you're learning about him. I don't feel like these interviews are the moment to kind of really press him. Like PBD and Officer Tatum, these are not the guys who are going to hold his feet to the fire. They're just going to ask him simple questions, give him an opportunity to explain, and then it's really on you, the viewer, to make your own assessment on what you feel about what Netanyahu has said based on your own knowledge. Okay, so let's get into some things that they talked about. So they talked about the relationship between Israel and Christian, and he was basically saying, Israel is the birthplace of Christianity. This is the only place in the Middle East where Christians are saved. And then he was talking about how Christians were basically kicked out of Bethlehem, and then that over a few decades, in Bethlehem, it used to be primarily or majority Christian, and now it's only 20% Christian. I think the rest are 80% Muslim or something like that. And so he's basically talking about how Christians have been displaced and they're kind of being threatened the same way that Jewish people or Israelis are being threatened. He also addresses the issue of Christians in Gaza being mistreated, and he says that there was a Christian church that was bombed, and he says, this was an accident. We're making an effort to help them rebuild the church. We're taking responsibility for this, and accidents do happen in war. And so I think it is interesting that he says accidents happen in war, because there is this idea that when you're in a war, anything goes, you can do whatever you want, you're trying to win. And so I don't know how much of it is an accident, because you do have to be very strategic in what you're trying to do, but there's also a general sense of the laws of war and what you can and can't do. So if you are making accidents or you have accidents like that, it is important that you're holding people accountable and you also prevent it from happening. Now, if you're being accused of a genocide and then an accident like this happened, that does kind of cloud things for people. And so yes, you can explain like, hey, we didn't mean to do this, we're making up for it and all of that stuff, but it does still leave a bad taste in some people's mouths. Netanyahu also goes on to say that Hamas does not respect Christianity, and he says that they basically respect Christians the way they are respecting the civilian, and the whole narrative around Hamas and civilians is that they are using them as human shields, and they are really using them to kind of make Israel and Israelis look bad. It's Israel who's the bad guy. They're doing all of this, and the idea that Hamas is creating propaganda, or they are allowing things to get really extreme so that they can hold this up and say, hey, look at what Israel's doing, they're responsible for this. And so basically both sides are playing the blame game. Now, one thing that he said that I found interesting was that he was saying that they basically send texts and calls to tell people to leave the area that they are possibly planning to bomb or attack. And I thought that this was super interesting because if you are in an environment where 90% of your homes have been damaged or destroyed, and you don't really have access to the things that you would have access to in your day-to-day life, how likely are you to be checking your cell phone and answering your cell phone? How quickly is this information as far as a warning going to spread? And then there's also the idea that because they give a warning, this then shifts the blame to Palestinians because, hey, we warned you, you didn't leave, this is on you. And so I think that is a very difficult stance, or a very difficult thing to hear, especially because these are people who have lost their homes and they also have nowhere to go. They're essentially locked in and trapped in this area. And so I think it is, yes, you can be warning people, hey, you guys need to flee, you guys need to protect yourselves, whatever. But if there's only so much that people can do to protect themselves, then the warning doesn't really mean much. Netanyahu also went on to say that basically out of all of the armies, all of the military in the world, they are the only ones who have gone above and beyond to provide aid to the people in Gaza. And I think they were saying that they provided maybe 200 million. Okay, so I just listened to the clip back, and basically Netanyahu says that they have provided 2 million tons of food for civilians in enemy territory, and he's basically saying nobody else has done this. And so this is him demonstrating that we have gone so far out of our way to make sure that civilians are protected. And so this becomes problematic when you think about how over 65% of the deaths in Gaza are civilian deaths, and so they're going through all of this effort to protect civilian lives, but civilian lives are being lost anyway. And so what they point to is that Hamas is using civilians as human shields, and in turn, even Gazans are getting frustrated and upset and angry at Hamas, and they are fighting back against them as well. This just seems to point to more evidence that Hamas is the bad guy, everyone is fighting them, everyone is trying to eliminate them as a threat and all of that stuff, and they are the reasons why all of these civilians are dying, because they're using them as human shields, they're stealing the food, and then they are the ones who are putting Palestinians in this position to where they do not have access to food, they do not have access to shelter, and they are at the risk of being killed or harmed because Hamas is doing the wrong thing. They are not the ones who are protecting and caring about the civilians the way that the Israelis are. Okay, so now let's talk about war crimes and the ICC. So we heard this in PBD's interview where he's basically saying that he was charged with war crimes. There was supposed to be an investigation into their legal system to make sure that they were actually investigating any claims of ill intent in terms of what their military, what their soldiers were doing. And this guy, Ahmad, he was supposed to come, he canceled the day of, and then the next thing he did was issue war crime charges against Netanyahu and somebody under him. And so this was problematic, he was saying, is because this guy is just doing this to get out of his own legal problems and his legal troubles. And so what he is essentially saying is that these war crime charges are not valid. Now, this is where we get into proportionality and the laws of war. So because Israel is claiming that Hamas is a threat to basically Israel, all of its people, there are 7.2 million people in Israel from what I was able to confirm, and basically what he is saying is that all 7.2 million people are at risk, and because 7.2 million people are at risk, if you compare that to the number of people who have died, I think the number is around 64k, obviously those numbers are going to be disproportionate. There's way more lives at stake if Hamas is able to attack Israel or harm Israel or go after Israel. So they're going to say that we're saving 7.2 million lives at the expense of 64k lives. And so obviously, if all 72 people are killed, then that is going to be disproportionate. Long story short, what I'm saying here is that when they talk about 7.2 million people being at risk of being attacked or threatened by Hamas or any other terrorist group, they're essentially saying that any number under that is always going to be proportionate because that number is much lower, right? So when you look at the issue that way, it's easy for Israel to say, hey, we're not committing a genocide. We're actually harming a lot less people than would be harmed if Hamas had its way and was able to enact terror on Israelis. Now, when it comes to laws of war, I do think it is a little bit problematic that this seems to be kind of open to interpretation. So I understand that whatever decision is made from a military point of view, that needs to be done in a way that is proportionate to any advantage that you would get if you were to take said action. And so obviously it's not really a numbers game, but it's just about what information that person had at the time that they gave an order or made a call. You're mainly just looking at what was known at the time that the order was given, right? And so I think in that sense it's difficult because you're not playing a numbers game. You're just trying to see like, hey, if we target this building and there's 10 people that we need to kill in there and we get those 10 people, whatever kind of happened is going to be worth it because we eliminate the threat of those 10 people. And it can vary, I guess, depending on how many civilian deaths there are. If there's 3, it may not be as big of a deal. If it's 10, maybe still not because it's 10 for 10. But if it's 10 people that you're trying to attack and it ends up in 300 civilians being killed, I think even that is a numbers game, but it's still open to interpretation because of whatever you can say those 10 people could have potentially did if they survived, if they were not targeted and all of that stuff. And so it does become confusing when you talk about the laws of war when it comes to how actions are perceived, because there are some people who are saying, this is a genocide, you're targeting Hamas, but you're targeting Muslims, you're targeting Palestinians, and then they're saying, no, we're just targeting a terror group, we're trying to protect our people. And so obviously there's different sides of the issue, and people seem to be working with different definitions of what they consider to be a genocide. And the other thing they talked about was the idea of journalists being killed. And so what Netanyahu was saying is that there are some journalists who are actually part of Hamas, so they're not real journalists. They're talking about this camera that was basically shot down. This was at Nasser Hospital, and basically there was a camera that was put up by a journalist, and this is where a bunch of journalists were gathering. They had cameras up, they were recording what was going on. This was their meeting place. And so what some people say is, hey, this camera had a white cloth over this was a known journalist camera. But Netanyahu is saying, hey, this camera is a threat to us because it's recording troop movement, it's giving away our position, that sort of thing. And so they shot the camera down. And then additionally there's talk that this was a double tap and they potentially hit the hospital up to 4 times. So this is problematic because you are shooting down this camera because it gives away your positioning, all of that stuff. But what was the end result? How many people died as a result of you targeting that hospital? And I believe they said that this was an accident and they did not mean to target a hospital. But then in this interview, he's also talking about how there are public places where civilians go that Hamas is taking over and making their command post, and that is why they have to target these public spaces. And so what it essentially amounts down to is that there's no safe place for civilians in Gaza. They are in danger either way you slice it. And he also talked about how there's underground tunnels for Hamas. And if you're thinking about it in that sense, Hamas is operating underground. You could easily clear out the people above ground while they are down there. But it seems like they're just really trying to focus on getting whatever they can that's underground. And that is them targeting civilians as a result. And so it's very complicated when you look into all of the different information about this issue, because there are a majority of people who see the issue the same way. This is a genocide, this is war crimes and all that stuff. But then there's people who are pro-Israel and saying that Israel has the right to defend itself regardless of what the outcome is of its actions. When you have this idea of a never-ending war or this enemy that you are constantly fighting, in that sense, anything can be justified, anything can be casualties of war if you are always under threat and you are always being threatened. It just seems like any civilian deaths is just like, oh well, that's just what it means to be in war. And so this is a very difficult topic to talk about when you kind of really break down what's going on and what the different arguments are. Now, in terms of feed zone, Netanyahu made it clear, like, hey, we are doing the most to help civilians. We've been trying to send in food, but Hamas is basically robbing the food trucks, and then they're turning around and selling the food at much higher prices than people can afford. And then he was also making the joke that because one Hamas soldier was so fat when he was holding somebody at hostage, he needs to go on Ozempic to lose weight, and he's just creating the narrative or explaining that the Hamas people are stealing all the food, they're eating it, they're doing all of this out of greed, they don't care about the civilians. And so he's really saying Hamas is the problem because they are basically raiding all of the food trucks and preventing the help from getting to civilians in Gaza. And he also addressed the issue of the viral photo of a little child who was emaciated. And what came out is, I think that this boy actually had genetic conditions going on. And so the result of how the kid looks in that photo is not completely because of starvation. And then I think there were also claims that there are no people in Gaza starving. And so I think that even if you have a kid with a genetic condition, if you saw that this kid was healthy 2 years ago and now this is what the kid looks like, it does point the picture that things are not easily accessible in Gaza as a result of this war, and this is the impact that it has on people. I don't think it should matter that this kid had a genetic condition that was also contributing to the situation. This is just evidence that this kid is not living a normal life. He doesn't have access to the things that he needs in order to survive, and this shows how extreme the situation is, that there are people who have been displaced, there are people who don't have proper access to food, and there are people who need medical treatment that they are not able to get because of this war that is going on and how long it has been going on. Now, I want to get into the genocide claims because we did talk about this a little bit, and Brandon made a point to say that he felt like you can't be committing a genocide if you're trying to help the people that you are said to be trying to kill. And so I thought that he's making his stance on this very clear. However, they are legally required to provide aid and food and all of that stuff to the civilians in the area, in the city, in the country that they are targeting. And so I think, yes, you can try to help the people you are trying to kill because you're supposed to do that for the civilians who are not a threat to you, to the civilians who are not actively fighting against you in order to eliminate you and all of that stuff. And so I can see what Brandon is trying to argue here, but I also think there are legal requirements for what you can and can't do in war that is also at play here. So yes, you could be trying to kill people, but you also are legally required to help people who are not a threat to you. I don't think it is as clear cut as this is not a genocide because you're trying to help. There is an effort to kind of displace people with the fact that over 90% of homes have been destroyed or damaged. So even if you were to stop the war today, these people do not have homes to go back to. They do not have a way of quickly rebuilding their community. And is Israel going to help these civilians rebuild their homes, rebuild their communities? And the answer is likely no. They're going to try to move those people elsewhere, or they're going to try and make it difficult for those people to live there if they continue to see Israel as a threat and they have animosity towards Israel because of everything that happened with this war. The other thing that they talked about was why they were even doing this interview, and then also the relationship between the US and Israel. And so basically, Netanyahu was saying that he thinks that Americans should do whatever they can to support Israel for Israel to be safe. And again, there's this idea that we are the only thing in between Hamas and whoever else is a terror organization. We are the only thing between you and them. If they get through us, they're coming for you guys next, and so we are really fighting for you too. And then he also talks about whether or not this is a spiritual alliance or just business between America and Israel. And I don't feel like he gave a clear answer on that, and his answer was kind of confusing, but this is where he was talking about how basically this alliance is beneficial because we're doing the dirty work. We're fighting for you by fighting for ourselves, because if they get through us, they're coming for you guys next. And there's this idea that Israel needs to get stronger and bigger, and they can only do that with America as its ally. And then lastly, Brandon gave Netanyahu an opportunity to give one message to all of the people watching, and he basically said that there are 5 things that are needed to end the war. Hamas needs to surrender, they need to give back the remaining hostages, they need to demilitarize Gaza, and Israel needs to have control over Gaza so that basically terrorism cannot return, and then there needs to be a transitional authority of Gaza, and whoever is running Gaza cannot allow those people to have any animosity towards Israel to where they want to retaliate because of this Israel-Gaza war. And then basically he ends by saying, if the terrorists win, America is next. Alrighty, so there was a lot that was talked about in this interview. It was very similar to all of the talking points in the PBD interview, and so there wasn't much here that was additional information, I feel, to what we heard in that first interview, especially if you watched my interview on PBD's interview with Netanyahu. But I did want to do a little bit more research coming into this interview just because it was so similar, and I wanted to have more information that I could refer to really understand the narrative that is being presented in these interviews, especially since people are saying that this is a propaganda tour, this is a PR tour where there's an effort to get people to be more pro-Israel. And so I do think that there is a lot of confusion on this issue because people can interpret those laws anyway, and that makes it very difficult to understand where people stand. However, I think that if you are in the middle of a war and you actively have more power than the person you're fighting, and you're just constantly going at them day after day, month after month, year after year, and you're not letting up, and you can see the damage that you're doing to civilians, I think at that point it becomes questionable whether or not you are in the right or you are in the wrong. And with this idea of a never-ending war, if you have the mindset, this is a never-ending war, I have to keep going until all threats are eliminated, everything and anything is justified at that point. And so you're not really going to care if people are saying, hey, this is a genocide, or hey, you're going too far, because for you want to win this war by any means necessary. I think this is a difficult topic to talk about, especially when there's so much information out there and you don't really know who to listen to. So I tried to do my own research going into this video covering this interview, and I do feel like I have a little bit more information, a little bit more context, because in terms of Israel and Gaza, this is not like the first time where Israel has been said to kind of operate outside of the laws of war and how they categorize or how they talk about their actions that they've taken to address any threats to the people in Israel. And so I think that this is probably going to be an ongoing issue. And as long as you have people who are interpreting the rules differently or framing the rules and the issues differently, there's never going to be a common understanding of what is happening. So I think there are people who are going to be convinced that this is a genocide no matter what, and there are other people who are going to be convinced that anything goes in war, all is fair when it comes to war and defending yourself. And so hopefully this interview is helpful in terms of giving you either more information or helping you to understand where you stand and where you land on these different issues. Let me know what you think about this interview in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.